specifically was what made my father so dangerous to the regime. And it was the fact that he was not trying to transform the powerful. He was trying to transform the powerless. He was empowering is a word that now everybody uses, but he was actually trying to empower the people in the sense, in the first and most primary step, which is your personal freedom.
I'm always
ready. All right, so you're listening. Welcome everybody to Pancon Podcast.
Welcome to the latest episode of Pancon Podcast.
¿Viste how organized this is?
Woo.
Welcome to Pancon Podcast. We are here with alleged chef and chili cook-off champion Michael Beltran.
Just one time.
Just one chili cook-off champion chasing his second championship. I am Nick Jiménez, the producer formerly known as Nick Jiménez. We have been suddenly joined by Emma, who is bringing drinks and probably still evading the Oreos that I offered her earlier because they're filled with meat instead of cream filling.
Yep.
And most importantly, we are joined by... Oh, there we go. There we go.
Take them all.
Those are all yours.
Me, please. Away from me. Thank you. Yeah.
We are joined by Rosa María Payá. We're going to get into who she is. I know that for a lot of our audience, that is not a name that you necessarily know, but I think that we can say with confidence it's a name you should know and that you will be glad by the time this is through that you know. She is the daughter of Oswaldo Payá, of the late Oswaldo Payá, who started the Movimiento Cristiano Liberación, and also as part of his activism, the Varela Project. I pulled up your Wikipedia page because
Made by me.
No, I know, and that's part of why I brought it up, because I think that this is a perfect illustration of, I think that on this podcast, and I'm sorry, I swear when I'm done hijacking your podcast.
No, this is good.
I think
this is good.
We talk a lot about the idea that the problem in Cuba is not in the past.
Exactly.
It's not something that people of some old generation in Miami are just still complaining about for reasons that are beyond anyone's understanding. It's now. And your Wikipedia page is part of the reason, is a good illustration of this. So the second sentence of the introductory paragraph to your Wikipedia page. The daughter of activist Oswaldo Payá, head of the Christian Liberation Movement, she took up much of his activist work after he died by involuntary manslaughter of Angel Carromero on the 22nd of July, 2012. So, of course, we're going to ask you about some of this, but part of why this was so important to me was because, as I've noted before on the podcast, I've been to Cuba 4 times, and the 4th time I was turned around and never allowed to go back. The only two people actually, who I ever, while I was in Cuba, actually told my real name to and kept in touch with were Roger Rubio and Harold Cepero. And one of them was in the car with your father. Angel Carromero, once he was in Spain, told the Washington Post that the Cuban government had drugged him and forced the testimony that led to this conclusion that this was involuntary manslaughter. They were run off the road. Mm-hmm. So, you have carried on your father's legacy with your activism, and that is where I will back out.
No, let me tell you, that is the best intro Nick has ever done. And
the inspiration was Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wikipedia is an interesting place, but it is what it is. Thank you for coming on the show.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, Michael, Nicolás. It's my pleasure to be here. I have heard about your podcast, about your your interest in communicating what the Cuban community is and what the Cuban community feels and have to offer, and also needs to the others to understand about. So thank you so much for doing that, and thanks also for beginning with a mention to my father and to, I understand, our dear friend Harold Cepero.
So, we've talked a lot on this podcast about, what it is to be Cuban here. I mean, I was born here. My family is Cuban. We're undoubtedly very still connected to our culture and so on and so forth. But we don't talk a lot about kind of what's happening in Cuba now. So, and I think talking a little bit about your story and kind of the journey that you've been through kind of says that story a little bit, right? What the state of Cuba is today, right?
I think that in a way the story of almost any Cubans reflects that. Mine in particular also reflects the perversity of that regime against those who dare to live in truth, to live according to their feeling, according to their thinking, according to their will. That's very, very dangerous in our country. And I probably also want to mention that your family is Cuban, but you are also Cuban.
Oh yeah.
And that's part of what I have discovered as very unfair in the understanding of the Cuban American community. I have now many friends that are as Cubans as I am, that probably knows more on tradition, history, and literature about my country than myself, that have never been in Cuba.
Right.
And I have been told, no, you have no right to talk about Cuba because you have never been there. So I was, for me it's important to mention that to you,
Yeah.
just for you to know that you're as Cuban as I am, with the same power and the same right to talk about our country, to defend the cause, that whatever cause they're defending,
Yeah.
And to show the world what Cubans are.
I think something that we've mentioned here also several times is like we feel like we're almost the children of a forgotten culture, right? Because 50 years ago, a lot of what made us special was suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And then when our families came here, we had to pivot and assimilate to what the American way of life was. And understandably so.
Yeah.
Because, my grandparents came here and they were trying to create a livelihood for their kids and what would end up being their grandkids, me and my cousins and my sister. And along the way, some people kind of forgot about how special our culture and who we are really is. And I think as I got older and I left Miami for 4 years, I felt even more connected to my roots when I left than when I was here. Because when I was here, it's like 80% Cuban here, right? So it's like you feel like you're with your people. And then when you leave, you're missing an entire part of your being.
You had your experience of exile when you leave Miami.
Well, when I lived in Virginia, it was a very different thing. And, I missed so many things about just who we are. And I think what makes us special. In my journey of food, I found like one of my missions in life was to honor our culture and my grandparents and my parents through our food, through a new conversation of food and a new conversation of what Cuban American food is and Cuban food is. So I appreciate you saying that, because I've had that conversation with several people. It's like, well, you were born in America, so you're an American. I said, well, yeah, I'm American, but I am
For sure.
I
That also.
am Cuban. there is no doubt that the inside of me, there is a fire that is not just from this country. It's from somewhere else. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. And it's like in your mind, trying to figure that out as you grow older and as you become an adult, and how you want to say your story and you want to leave your legacy one day. It's a lot. So tell me about your journey a little bit. Tell me about from the beginning. It's a lot, I know.
Yeah, it's a lot, and probably there are a lot of non so interesting information there. I suppose that the real answer begins with the history of my father, with the history of my family, which was and is a regular Cuban family, living inside the island with the half or more of his members living outside the island, having that very difficult experience of separation, of division, of incommunication for a lot of time also. But my family was different from the majority of the Cuban families in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in the sense that they were never part of the system. They were never part of what the American people knows by the revolution or the Cuban Communist Party, and that's a very peculiar characteristic. It's not something that a lot of families did in Cuba, especially not in the last half of the communism in the island. At the beginning, of course, many families were immediately against what was taking place. Many of them were forced to exile. Others were later also forced to exile.
Yeah.
And in the late 80s and in the 90s, the situation was more or less controlled by the regime, but the seek for freedom, the seek for finding your own way in life is something which is merely human.
Human nature.
Exactly. I mean, not even 40 years of communism could take that out of the human nature, that out of the Cuban people. So that many families in Cuba in that moment and also now still rebel against that oppressive power. My family was one of them. My experience is different to the experience of many of my friends in the high school or in the university, for instance. In some ways, I had it harder because I saw the repudiation acts. I don't know if that's something that the American people understand. Un acto de repudio is something similar to a Nazi pogrom, in which the paramilitaries of the Cuban Communist Party, or trained by the Cuban Communist Party, go to your house and start to scream and attack and sometimes even assault their house and the people that is inside the house. That happened to my family during my childhood.
How old were you?
I was 7 years old. I was not in the house in that moment, so
wow.
I didn't actually leave it. I just remember seeing the signs that they painted in the front of my house, which was a very humble house. I remember those signs. I think that there are pictures in internet with.
So they paint on your house.
Yes, they paint on the door and on the front door and on the front wall of the house also. They paint the word gusano, worn. And they paint also things like Viva Fidel, that kind of things, with black painting. And that happened to my family. But at the same time, I had an experience of freedom that my friends in high school and in the university didn't. Even when everybody, or at least the most part of them, think like us and saw like us in that moment also. I had the freedom of saying whatever I decided to. I had the freedom of express myself in any way, and my father and my mother, the answer of them to our freedom of expression was, you just say whatever you think, and then we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
But the answer that my friends in high school received from their parents were, hey, you keep your mouth shut. You keep silence. Everything that you are hearing or thinking inside your house have to be secret. And they forced them to live kind of a double life out of fear.
Wow.
That was the experience of my friends. In that sense, I was privileged to grow up in the middle of a jail as a free person. That's something that I really appreciate from my family. That's something that I have a lot of gratitude for my parents and my whole family for keeping that for us.
What part of Cuba is your family from?
From Havana. Well, my grandpas from the part of my mother are from Pinar del Rio.
My family. Yeah.
Probably that's why they're tobacco.
Yeah.
But my grandpas got married in Havana, and they live in Havana the most part of their life.
Yeah. My whole family, well, the family that I know is from Pinar del Rio, and very proud Cubans. They've been here for a long time, and they miss their country dearly, but very proud. So tell me that it's interesting that you mentioned your parents gave you the freedom to be who you were, to think and say the things that you wanted to say. How has that impacted you in your adult life? I'm sure that's had an enormous amount of impact long term, yeah?
Yes. Well, I mean, the first impacts were during those years, of course, that teachers didn't react that well to our freedom of expression. We got into some troubles in high school and in the university. I had teachers that dared to threaten us with expelling me from the university for not signing a commitment to go wherever the revolution sends me, for instance. All my friends signed that, even when they were not ready to do it, and they were telling, just sign. We're not going to do it, but we are going to sign. Because that's the kind of behavior of that communists encourage.
Control.
Yes, it's a culture of fear. It's a culture in which, after a while, everybody understands that the regime is not what they sell. Everybody understands that their lives are now more miserable because of the regime. Everybody understands that they are less free, that they are poor, that they have more problems to getting out of their own and specific situations because they don't have the freedom to do it. Everybody understands that after a while, but also everybody understands that to express that is going to get you into trouble. So people live in fear, and my father used to say that the culture of fear is a culture of simulation.
Oh, yeah.
And that's dramatic. I mean, that's a tragedy for our people to have been living the most part of your life in a lie, pretending something that you are not, pretending to believe in something that you do not believe in, that breaks you. And that's what communism does to societies.
It's interesting you mentioned that when you were in university and they made you sign these papers of like just saying that you were going to go wherever the regime would send you. Were there ever any teachers that were opposed in opposition to that idea, or were they all in line with that idea? Which is saying, like, were there any teachers that were
solidarious?
Yeah.
They were teachers that were not they refused to repress, and that's brave enough for Havana University. They were some of those. They were others that were part of the repression apparatus. It is a machinery that uses everybody, and at the same time kind of embarrass everybody, because they need also you to live with shame. They need you to live as an accomplices of the dirty sins that they force you to do.
They need you to feel responsible for what's happening.
Yes.
It's major manipulation.
Yes, and it's also part of what I think we as a people, we have to assume, to understand, to accept, and to change,
right.
and to overcome. But also acknowledging our part of responsibility in what is taking place.
Yeah, I mean, the change would start with the people.
Yes.
I mean, there's more people than there are the others.
Yes, and that was that's actually very, very good point, because that was the point of my father. That specifically was what made my father so dangerous to the regime. And it was the fact that he was not trying to transform the powerful. He was trying to transform the powerless. He was empowering is a word that now everybody uses, but he was actually trying to empower the people in the sense, in the first and most primary step, which is your personal freedom, your personal liberation. That was how actually he called it. I mean, the first change has to take place inside the person.
Yeah.
And his project that was a hole that he found in the Constitution, even in the Communist Constitution. There was an article that allowed the Cuban citizens to have initiative of law. So to actually that translates to the Cuban people has an opportunity to write a bill. A citizen could write a bill, but it's not a bill until more than 10,000 other Cuban citizens sign it also. In the moment that you gather 10,000 signatures for your project of law, it immediately becomes a bill, and the assembly of the communist regime has to discuss it.
Wow.
They, of course, Fidel and Raúl Castro never saw that anyone were going to there to collect the signatures to change the system. Well, my father and a group of very crazy and brave people did it. And they collect not 10,000, they collect tens of thousands of signatures to present a project of law that had 5 points. And was to change the law to guarantee freedom of expression, freedom of association, the liberation of the political prisoners, that have been tens of thousands during these 60 years, the possibility to have private enterprises and a new electoral law that allows free, fair, and multi-party elections. That is the Varela Project, and was not just the proposal of the law. It ended with a referendum. It was actually a proposal for a referendum, not for the General Assembly of the dictatorship to approve it, but for the General Assembly to ask the Cuban people if they want it.
Wow.
Which is actually what have never happened in Cuba, because people that listen to us could have this romantic idea that the Cuban people is somehow happy in the way that they live, they could have been listening to the stories about the education of the healthcare,
right.
or just they could have heard that, well, Fidel Castro have been there for 60 years and now his brother, and that's not normal in democracy, but the people in Cuba wanted that way. That's a lie. At least that's not. I study physics, so I try to be very rigorous when I talk. At least that haven't been proved.
Right.
Because the Cuban regime have never ever asked to the people actually what do they want.
Right.
Have never ever submit themselves to the will of the people. So to speak in a language that I think American people understand, the Cuban Revolution have never ever have the consent of the people. Never. And that was what my father was proposing. Of course, not to give consent to the dictatorship, but to change the system with the consent of the Cuban people. For the first time in more than 50 years, the reaction of the regime, the reaction of Fidel Castro in that moment, the personal reaction, was to change the communist constitution to make the system irrevocable and to make the socialism irrevocable. And of course, with that, he was not invalidating the Varela Project, because that was something that was made after the Varela Project, and you cannot make a law with that kind of retroactive power. But it doesn't matter when you have total power. When you are a totalitarian regime, they ignore their own law, they violated their own law, they never answered to the Varela Project, and they put in jail all the leaders of the Varela Project, with the exception of my father, who they killed 10 years after that. He was with Harold Cepero. Harold and Nicolás friends. Harold was 32 years old when he was killed in 2012, together with my father. But when the Varela Project was in their more hot moment, just for saying that like that, he was in the university. He was studying veterinary.
Yeah.
Help me with that word. Veterinaria.
Yeah, a veterinary school.
Oh, a veterinary school.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. You nailed it.
And we can keep doing that. Any other one that you need?
Yeah.
Yes.
We're here for all that.
Thanks.
In fact, if you want to say it again, and then we'll edit it so it looks like...
He was a student in the university, and in the University of Camagüey, actually. And he was so brave and so brilliant and so generous that when Harold Cepero got in contact with the Varela Project, of course he was not a friend of my father or my friend in that moment. We are talking 2003, 2004. And he said, okay, I cannot read this and sign this and not to share this with my friends in the university. And he started to talk about the Varela Project at the university. And he and Roger and a group of friends started to share the Varela Project with the people in the university. And that's something that American people could be listening to that and saying, okay, that's normal, we do that every day at the university, you enter in any campus in the States and you're going to find a lot of campaigns, a lot of people defending their causes, trying to recruit people to their causes. But in the Cuban communist regime, the universities belong to the revolutionaries. And that is not something that I'm inventing. That's the actual slogan of the Cuban Revolution. The university is exclusively for revolutionaries. And revolutionaries are people from the Communist Party, people from the Communist Youth, or people that submit themselves to those institutions. And Harold was the opposite of that, and he did it. So that the dean himself expelled him from the university, but like physically pushed him from the University of Camagüey, him and other friends, because of their enthusiasm with something that was actually in the Cuban law,
Right.
and that was the Varela Project. After that, Harold entered in the seminary. He was studying to be a priest. After that, he realized that he was not called to be priest. So he returned to the Christian Liberation movement, to the Movimiento Cristiano Liberación. That was the movement that my father founded. And he became one of the most important leaders of the movement. And in the middle of that, he was accompanying my father to Santiago de Cuba, which is the second city in importance in the country. A big part of the movement has presence there in Santiago, so they were traveling to Santiago to see other people from the movement, and agents of the Cuban State Security hit their car from behind, run them off the road, and the next thing that we knew was that my father was dead. And hours later, Cepero was also dead in the hospital without receiving any medical attention. And the other two persons that were traveling with them were disappeared, uncommunicated by the Cuban State Security, and they remained like that till they were expelled from the country.
I just want to, not to throw it, but you mentioned the thing about the Constitution saying that the socialist nature of the country is zero. I think some people might hear that and think that it's a phrase that you're using. But I've pulled up, this is what I was doing on my phone. I was looking for the Cuban Constitution in English. For anyone who this is like the first time that you spent more than 5 minutes thinking about Cuba in this way, this is the actual text of Article 4 of the Constitution. Just try to wrap your head around anything even remotely like this happening here. The defense of our socialist homeland is the greatest honor and the supreme duty of every Cuban. Treason is the most serious of crimes. Whoever should commit treason will be subject to the most severe consequences. Very typical Cuban government vague language.
Well, the more severe consequences are very specific in the
Right.
case of Cuba, because the death penalty is the most
Correct.
severe consequence.
And then the next line is, the socialist system that this Constitution supports is irrevocable. Citizens have the right to combat through any means, including armed combat when other means are not available, against any that intend to topple the political, social, and economic order established by this Constitution. So the Constitution basically, in theory, would have given anyone the right to walk up to your father and shoot him in the head.
That's a very good point, because you're reading the Constitution of 2019. That was actually the second time that they changed, well, actually the third one, because they, very quickly, Batista in 1952 perpetrated a coup, and he basically stopped the constitutional order of the Cuban people. Of Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
He broke it. So in 1959, when the July 26 movement got to power with Fidel Castro leading, they didn't follow the Constitution of 1940. That was the one that Batista disrespect. But they start to rule without a real constitution. I mean, under the protection of the Soviet Union and the crazy head of Fidel Castro. In 1976, they finally approved their constitution without, of course, the consent of the people, at least not the consent of the people, in a free and fair plebiscite. And then in 1992, they have to slightly reform that constitution because the Soviet Union disappeared, and the Soviet Union was in the prologue of the Cuban Communist Constitution. So they need to reform that, and then in 2003, after the Varela project, they have to change their own law to prevent Cubans to obtain their rights. And then in 2019, they have to change the constitution again to be even more specific in the sense of taking any possibility for the Cuban people to use the law to change the system off the table. And that's a direct answer to the initiative that we promote and that we have been defending since 2015, which is actually a continuation of the Varela project. The Varela project was a call for a referendum. The Cuban regime aberrated their own law to make impossible that. The Cuban regime put the leaders of the Varela project in jail. What the Cuban regime never did was actually asking to the people. So in 2010, my father started a campaign, wrote an article with the intention of starting a campaign saying, okay, you are violating your own law, you're violating the international law, you're violating common sense. So let's skip some steps here and go directly to the plebiscite. Let's ask to the Cuban people in the ballot box if they want free, fair, multi-party elections. Because if the Cuban people want free, fair, multi-party elections, we need a new system. Because your constitution forbids that to happen.
Right.
That's the idea that we took to start Cuba Decide, which is Cuba Decides, which is an initiative to change the system in Cuba. And the technical tool that we promote is the holding of a plebiscite, of that plebiscite that my father proposed. And, of course, that's the technical tool. A lot of things have to happen. Even more important than the plebiscite itself are the conditions previous to the plebiscite. And that condition should be freedom of expression, freedom of association, the points of the Varela project, actually. And, of course, the central point in Cuba Decide is not even the technical tool, but the real strategy, which is how the Cuban people is going to generate the amount of pressure to force that criminals in power to submit to the will of the people. And the answer is, well, with civic disobedience, with organization, moving or mobilizing the Cubans inside, but also the Cubans outside, the Cuban nation that lives inside and also outside the island, but also moving the international community, moving the centers of powers, moving the democracies of the world in the sense of supporting that people. And in the middle of that campaign, the Cuban regime changed their own constitution to do first that terrible Article 4 that you just read, which is followed by an Article 5 that established the political system as a single party system, a single communist, Fidelista and Marxist system, and I'm quoting also Article 5. And for first time in the history of the Cuban law, they define plebiscites, which is something that, by the way, we are asking because among other things, they were not regulated in law. So if they are not regulated, they are not forbid. We could ask for that. Well, they regulated, but they regulated as mere surveys, And that Cuban Constitution, you could check the last article of the Constitution. I think it's Article 237 or something like that, because they have a lot of articles. And that article states that you cannot use any of these tools to change the system.
Wow.
So, were we or my fathers thinking in the possibility of the Cuban regime transforming itself, or actually opening by goodwill to the Cuban people? Of course not. At the end of the day, this is a fight of families that conform a society, a nation, against criminals in power. And of course that there is a roadmap to make that change possible, organized, pacific, understandable for the international community, according with the international law. And that's the plebiscite, and that's the transition process. But before that comes that personal liberation that we were talking about.
Yes.
And comes that mobilization of the Cuban society in and out, and of the international community, and that's what we are doing with Cuba Decide.
So basically, it's a lot of information for a lot of people.
I'm sorry.
No,
I
don't
should
be sorry. This is
More vodka.
This is
More simple. Let's
No.
next time.
the Constitution. The way that we've put it, so everyone understands it, has suppressed every chance that the people themselves have to have a voice.
Exactly.
And not only has it suppressed any chance they have to have a voice, if they have a voice, they can literally be killed in the middle of the street for having that voice.
Exactly. They now the regime has the constitutional right to kill you if you want to change the system.
So this, the reason why I say that just very simply, just come on, Leonard, you can walk through. The way I put that simply so people understand it is for all the people that have for so many times told me and so many people around me that things are different. Not only are they different, they may be worse
Oh yes.
than what they were 10 years ago, 30 years ago, because they have just buttoned up any small loophole that they have missed.
Exactly. They have been perfecting their system of repression, and they have been closing the system and in a way protecting the system from the citizen initiative, from the human nature, from the will of change. They have, and that is something that they share with other regimes right now in the world that have been also evolving to remain in power. But in the very specific case of the Cuban dictatorship, of the Cuban regime, they have learned from other experiences. They have learned from what happened in the Soviet Union. They have learned from what happened in Chile. They have learned from the end of the apartheid in South Africa. They have learned from the transition in Spain, and they have been transforming their system to make impossible to use that rules against them in a very perverse way. But that is not going to be a reason to stop trying. We just know that we cannot use their law, but that was something kind of logic from the beginning. Of course, that the idea was never rely on their law, was relying on the will of the Cuban people, and that will is a will of change. And the only thing that is sustaining the power of the Communist Party right now is their criminal activity and the repression. I mean, the moment in which, the day that they do not exert violence, or that they cannot exert exert violence against the people, that day they disappear.
It's a lot.
There's a lot there. Yeah.
It's a lot. It's taken me a while to just like put together the next things that I want to say, because it's incredible to me the amount of time that I've spent talking to people that don't necessarily understand this, right? The fact that the change, and those things that so many people around the world say that are good about Cuba, the healthcare, the education, all those things.
That are lies, by the way.
They're all lies.
We don't have to talk about that, but are lies.
They're all lies. But they don't want to look past the surface, because people are so quickly to just accept, like, oh no, but that's fine. This is what we're being told, that's fine. And honestly, Cuba is a small country, 90 miles away from South Florida, and a lot of people in Middle America and around the country don't want to spend their brain power thinking about that.
Well, they should. I mean, I don't want to be rude.
No, they should. No, you're right. They should. They should,
But-
because it's something to be said that can happen so close to this country, and for us to be okay with it. And then to say, I don't know how long ago things changed, to say that things changed and they changed for the better.
Yes, and the consequences for the hemisphere, including United States, of have tolerated 60 years of communist dictatorship in the island of Cuba have been devastating. Have been devastating to Venezuela, have been devastating to Nicaragua, have been devastating to the democratic stability of the hemisphere, have been devastating to the even to the fight against the criminal activities in the region, and the consequences are also lived here in the United States, because this country is, for instance, the number one consumer of drugs in the hemisphere. And Cuba have been part of that, or the Cuban regime have been part of that machinery for decades right now. The Cuban regime have been providing sanctuary to terrorists for decades right now. Not just Latin American terrorists, not just the Colombian guerrillas, but also American terrorists, but also European terrorists. The Cuban regime has put together what I think, and now you could think that this is exaggerated, but I honestly think that the Cuban intelligence apparatus that is known by the letter G and the number 2, the G2, the Cuban intelligence security apparatus, was very well trained by the KGB at the beginning. Then they were even better trained by the Stasi, the German intelligence apparatus. I'm not inventing this. You can go to Berlin or Google it and find, for instance, that the interference plans of the Cuban state security in Latin America are actually German plans, are plans created in collaboration with the Stasi during the 80s. So that in that sense, I believe that right now, for instance, the Cuban intelligence apparatus has a much more wide understanding and a bigger, by far, influence in the region than the CIA, for instance. And we could be against any kind of influence, CIA and G2, but it's very, very dangerous that a communist regime has that kind of influence in Latin America. And there we are talking about infiltration of political movements, interference of social movements, trafficking in persons through the Cuban communist medical brigades, corruption through, for instance, the coimas of Odebrecht, given sanctuary to terrorists, and all the related with the drug dealer activities in the region. The relationships between the Cuban intelligence apparatus and the Colombian guerrillas as FARC are so anxious is the revolution. I mean, the first conversations between the FARC and Fidel Castro took place at the end of the 50s.
Wow.
And the beginning of the 60s. Another Colombian guerrilla, as the ELN, but I don't know how to translate it for English.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I'll come back.
Please.
Google that, Nick.
Was co-founded by Fidel Castro. Actually, the head of the ELN lives now in Havana, and the Colombian government have been asking for the extradition of Gavino, which is the leader of the ELN, and the Cuban regime have been refusing that. And the ELN now has a big part of the Venezuelan territory, and the Venezuelan crisis that have been provoked by the Cuban regime, at least co-provoked by the Cuban regime, has caused the biggest crisis of refugees that this hemisphere have lived, I don't know, in the last 100 years.
So the ELN in Spanish, NLA, which was why, the National Liberation Army.
Thank you so much.
So let me ask you, just from obviously what you've seen, why has it been so easy for the United States to turn a blind eye to this for so long?
Well, I don't think it has been easy. This country passed by the experience of the missile
Yeah, the missile crisis.
The Cuban
missile
Missile Crisis,
crisis.
Yeah.
Thank you. And after that, they signed an agreement with the Soviet Union, and a pact actually that prevent United States for interfering. That's one of the words that they use. The Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement. You could Google it, please. Which actually prevent United States of interfering in any Cuban domestic issue, but also commands the government of United States to stop any intent of defeating the Cuban Revolution, any intent organized in United States or in the surrounding territories. So it's not just a non-aggression pact. It's actually the way in which Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev make Kennedy and United States following administrations, not just to commit with the idea of not disturbing Fidel Castro, but also with the idea of taking care that anyone in the region was disturbing Fidel Castro. And that's a legal document that was signed after Nikita Khrushchev put 42 missiles in Cuban territory to threaten this country's security. That happened. That's something that the most part of the people doesn't know about it. But that agreement have been respected by all the administrations of this country since Kennedy administration.
Wow.
It's very frustrating, but it's reality, and I mean it's history. But the other face of the coin is that what Fidel Castro said is that he was being attacked from the United States, and what he said to the world was that he was David in front of Goliath.
Yeah.
And I mean, the rest of the world love that kind of stories, especially if they give them the opportunity to be against United States.
For sure.
So that was very, very well thought by the Cuban regime, and that have been present till today. I mean, that's a very heavy weight that all the Cuban people carry over our shoulders, and it's the fact that the rest of the world is not, when they look at Cuba, they are not actually seeing us. They are not seeing the Cuban people. They are seeing through all these crystals of ideology and lies and
Thank
being
you.
against the United States and being against imperialism and with all those.
You want something else?
Another one,
Okay.
please. All that garbage, all that crap in the middle prevent solidarity. I mean, the Cuban people haven't enjoyed solidarity from the world almost never. I mean, and we have been suffering one of the most violent, aggressive, and criminal dictatorships in the world.
And if we were going to fight against that, we would fight against it alone. It's basically, we would fight against it alone.
Yes.
Because basically everything that you said would mean that, again, it goes back to the Cuban people themselves making that decision to fight against the regime inside of Cuba. Because they would have to make that decision to do that.
Oh,
Because
we
the rest of
are-
the world is kind of just okay with it being the way that it is.
Michael, that was the reason Fidel and Raúl Castro decided to kill my father. The reason was that they, in some point, realized that they could do it and get away with that, and get away with murdering the most important dissident of that decade of the Cuban history, and get away with that. And they did it, and nothing have happened.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. And that's why this that we are talking in such a light way
Yeah.
with my very bad English has so tragic consequences over the life of the Cuban people and for our nation, because the price of loneliness is the slaughtering. The price is the impunity. I mean, when the rest of the world decide to make silence or to look away, what they are actually granting is impunity to the criminals. And that's what we have been suffering, but not now, not just my family, not just my father, from the very beginning, from 1959. The amount of people that I have got to know in this city that have friends, fathers, grandfathers that were killed in the first years of the revolution without even the idea of a fair trial is huge. I mean, we are talking about thousands of people killed in extrajudicial or arbitrary executions. We're talking about tens of thousands of political prisoners. We're talking about probably also tens of thousands of people that have disappeared trying to escape the country. We don't even have the actual math, and we don't have it because that dictatorship hasn't ended. So we haven't been able to actually count our deaths.
Jeez. It puts for the people that may listen to this that aren't like that may not be of Cuban descent or be Cuban or whatever, it puts a lot of things in perspective for a lot of people. Because again, you go a lot of places all over the country And when you say that you're Cuban, a lot of people don't know what that means, really. They don't understand the gravity of that for us. You know, like we lost a lot of things about our culture, our people, our country. You know, my grandparents lost everything that they knew to come here to give us another opportunity. And there's people that have lost their lives. They've lost their freedom. They've lost so many things. And we're still living that today. And that is, to me, it's tragic that it happened and that it's happened. What's even more tragic is that it continues to happen and that people continue to turn a blind eye to it and pretend that things are getting better.
There's not an excuse for that. I mean, I know that you have very curiously said that it's a lot of information. I have touched a lot of points. Probably that's not a didactic way of doing this.
No, this is the perfect way to do this.
But we could make it very simple. I mean, here in the state, you have the opportunity to choose whoever is going to run the country. That's something that the Cuban people hasn't had in almost 75 years. There's not an excuse for that. There's not an excuse for preventing a nation, preventing a people from their right to decide.
Even that is true. We have an opportunity to decide who runs the country, but even more so, we can say when we don't like who runs the country.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean,
we can sit here.
We can open that door,
and we can trash all the people that we don't like. And I'm pretty confident in the fact that I'm gonna make it home.
Yes, you are.
We've done it a lot on this podcast.
We have done it several times on this podcast, and we will continue to do so. In Cuba, they can't do that. They can't openly say things and feel comfortable with their walk home. Oh, yeah. And that, to me, I can't even imagine. At least being the way that I am, the way that I torch things that I think are wrong, and I think that I'm incredibly opposed to. I couldn't imagine not having that freedom. And I have that freedom because my grandparents sacrificed everything to give it to me. And that, to me, is the greatest gift I've ever been given. And it happened way before I was even born. Mm-hmm. So it keeps on just going in circles in my head, is the fact that people keep on saying that it's better. Things are better. Things are getting better. And they're just not. They are not getting better.
Are getting worse. And getting worse from any point of view. Are getting worse since the point of view of the radicalization of the regime and law. Are getting worse from the point of view of the quality of life of the Cuban people. I mean, the whole point of why we that are embedded in this fight for freedom had to make a donation drive was because the Cuban people is starving.
Well done, by the way.
Yeah, that was a good segue.
A good transition.
For you not doing podcasts very often, that was an incredible segue. I could not have done that better myself.
I'm probably going to start a podcast now
Good.
in Spanglish.
That's good. Nick can do all the producing.
It was because Cuba is in crisis, but in a very serious crisis, in a humanitarian crisis. I mean, just imagine that the whole system, education, healthcare, infrastructure, transportation, everything collapsed. But they collapsed 10 years ago, and they have been running inertially, and now there is no any resource that the Cuban people could use. Right now, you are, if you're in Cuba, you are praying for your kids, your elderly, not to get sick, because if you enter to a hospital, you're probably going to leave the hospital sicker than when you enter. I mean, we are talking. I don't want to be graphic because it's very tragic, but you could enter to an urgent care run in Cuba and find puddles of urine below the beds of the sick, of the people that is there. There is no food, there is no medicines, there is no water, there is no running water in many places in Cuba, and all this is taking place in the in the midst of the COVID-19. I mean, people is actually suffering, not just the lack of freedom, but the lack of freedom in the middle of a crisis, in which is dramatic for a mother, for a father, not to have anything to give to their children and not to have the possibility of do anything to change that situation. That's the most dramatic thing, and that's why with this donation drive and the reaction of the regime to the thousands of pounds of humanitarian aid that we sent and that we got to put in the Puerto of Mariel in Cuban Harbor was to block that humanitarian aid. And they have been arbitrarily retaining cans of food and medicine and hygiene products in the midst of a humanitarian crisis just because they don't want that the independent civil society and the Cuban churches, the Christian churches, to be the ones that actually distribute that humanitarian aid.
So I
want to get this. I want to get this completely straight. So, you guys started a drive for all kinds of products, health products, food, hygiene products, all those things. The world, in the last 8 months, has been in a worldwide pandemic. We have talked at length how the United States is in crisis. The United States is in pretty good shape compared to other parts of the world, which I don't know if people want to hear that or not, but it's true. Mm-hmm. So you guys, how much are we talking? Like, how much stuff, this drive, what did it produce exactly? Like, how many pounds of things?
Like 50,000 pounds of food and medicines and hygiene products, which is not a lot, but it's important to say that everything was collected in one day, and everything was totally citizen-led. There was zero money from government institutions, organizations. Everything was just put there by the people, by the community.
U.S. government. And then, so the idea was to send this to Cuba, and then for it to get distributed how?
We, ahead of that, we talked with some religious leaders and also with some civil society leaders. And here I have to make a parenthesis. Civil society in Cuba.
I was going to ask you what that meant.
Yes. Independent civil society, which is usually an adjective that you don't use for civil society, but civil society should be independent. But in the communist regime, they are gongos that they sell to the international community as independent organizations that actually are in charge of repression. And there is the brave people that dare to live in truth and dare to organize themselves to help the people, and they are subjects of repression. Those kind of people were the ones that we talk with, and some of them are heads of the position, some of them are independent artists that were ready to distribute that humanitarian aid. So we created a network of religious leaders and independent leaders of the civil society that were ready to receive that humanitarian aid and distribute it among the people. Ahead of time, also, we created a website and invited the Cuban families to register with their name, phone number, and address to try to get those that actually need or that were in a more critical need for these products. Almost 15,000 families registered. Families, yes.
Okay.
And this is a very big number because what you still don't know is that the Cuban regime blocked our website a few hours after we put it out.
A few hours.
If I can
few
just,
hours.
for people listening, because you mentioned gongos, it's a term that I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with here because it's such an alien idea. We're familiar with NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. A gongo is a government-organized, non-governmental organization.
Government-organized, Say it again? One more time?
Government-organized, non-governmental organization.
I like
it's
it.
like the organization of, I don't know, the Federation of Women in Cuba, which is led by the Communist Party, organized by the regime, but presented to the world as an NGO. We were not talking about those. We were talking about dissidents, we were talking about independent artists, we were talking about
People.
religious leaders. Actual NGOs that, of course, are not recognized by the Cuban regime. By the way, many of the Cuban churches are non-recognized by the Cuban regime either, and they have been struggling to survive because they intervene their temples. My English is not enough to explain what they do with the Christian churches in Cuba.
So there's churches. Oh man, such a mess. So there's churches also that are not recognized by the Cuban government.
Oh, the most part of them. I mean, I don't know exactly the number, but in 1959 there were, let's say, 110 churches in Cuba, including the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, Evangelical Church. 110. But in 60 years, a lot of new denominations have appeared in the world, and
Right.
also in Cuba. Neither of those are recognized. Many of them are under repression. Many of those, a leader has been in jail or expelled from their houses, expelled from their temples. It's
Because
it's
religion
communism.
religion is a freedom. To be able to to express your own religious beliefs is a freedom.
The thing is that the system cannot tolerate any alternative, even if the alternative is not contrary to the regime. It is an alternative. Communists cannot live with that.
How can somebody say that to themselves and think that that is okay? Because it's like, I don't know. Just how you said it, it doesn't make any sense to me. So for them, even if they're not against the government, even the government won't recognize them because it's not the religion that they recognize?
Well, that's a very good point, and I think that's a point for everybody that is listening to ask to yourself, how much are you ready to forgive? How much are you ready to apologize? In the name of what? In the name of an ideology? In the name of an ideal? In the name of or out of hate for another for another cause? How much are you ready to apologize? And we have been victims of that bias from the rest of the world. In the case of the Cuban people, if I get your question right, in the case of the Cuban people, I'm not making apologies for our people, but well, we live under a totalitarian, very aggressive, violent police kind of regime, in which in the moment that you express yourself, you are going to be repressed. You could be in jail, you could be just expelled from the university, you could be, maybe it's your family, the one that is going to pay the price, or you could be killed.
The last two are obviously the worst. Your family pays the price for you having a freedom of expression, or obviously you are no longer with the world. back to the drive. So, collected 50,000 pounds of all these different types of products. You only had a website up for a few hours, and then the Cuban government blocked it. And then in those few hours, you had 15,000 families, which could easily represent over 50,000 people.
Yeah, and some of them were able to enter later through VPNs that, by the way, now have been blocked also. And they block also Telegram.
Telegram?
Yes.
They blocked Telegram?
Yes.
Fuck. So, then...
Coño, las groserías, man.
Sorry, man. So...
Yo debo estar medio sorda.
So then, what happened next? After you had this array of people that were willing to distribute product, you had 15,000 families. What happened next?
Well, they militarized the municipio of Mariel, so the town where the port is, which is known as Mariel, is close to Pinar del Rio. They militarized the town. They used the COVID excuse to close all the ways to enter and to get out of the town.
Of course they
and
did.
to the port, and they threatened the religious leaders that were in charge of receiving the cargo, because, by the way, we didn't send the cargo as ourselves. We donate everything to a church here in the States that made a donation to another church in Cuba in order to be able to actually make the process. Because if we as a civil society organization, a Cuban civil society organization, make that donation, the Cuban regime is not going to accept it from the beginning. I mean, they are going to prevent the freight forward for doing the process. So we had to do it in that way, and even in that way, they threatened one of the religious leaders that were in charge of receiving the cargo, and they basically retained the cargo that have been retained for more than 2 months now, in the middle of a humanitarian crisis. And many of those religious leaders went out and asked publicly for the liberation of the humanitarian aid. Many of the Cuban citizens, many of those 15,000 families also did it. People in the international community also pronounced heads of some of these churches, but like world heads of those churches also pronounced. And the answer of the regime have been just confiscating all the tens of thousands of pounds of food and hygiene products and medicines that the Cuban people needs. And by the way, I'm just going to make a very quick explanation. We are doing this through religious leaders and independent civil society because historically all the donations that are sent to the island and ends or lands in the hands of the Cuban regime are then sold to the Cuban people.
Oh, sold.
Sold, thank you,
Yeah,
to the
no,
Cuban
no,
people.
I'm just...
Well, they sell the humanitarian aid.
So
We cannot give it to them because they are going to sell it, and the Cuban people have no money and have no capacity to do it. But what happened to you?
Mike's gonna have a stroke.
So then they get the food and the things that people donate,
And they sell it.
and then they sell it. So this is things getting better. This is what we call getting better. This is so... it's crazy. So the
tragic.
50,000 pounds of things, where are the 50,000 pounds?
We don't know. We suppose that the last time that we saw it was through the GPS tracker that we put in the containers that were more likely destroyed because we lost signal more than 2 months ago.
So
They were in the port of Mariel.
right. So Raul's probably eating cans of Goya right now.
Yeah, of
On a
Goya.
golden
by the
chair.
way. A lot of Goya.
On
there.
all of his baby wipes that he's probably sitting on, and then he's going to sell them to the people. It's just crazy. It's just like, when Nick first mentioned, we talked about this like a month ago.
How long ago was it? When was the?
Well, the donation drive was in May.
Yeah.
We were able to announce that the food was in Cuba
Yeah.
in August.
Yeah.
August.
And this was something
Birthday.
that to your point, a lot of people here, even people who were not usually engaged in this sort of thing, participated in. The one who comes to mind, just because I follow him and he's been invited here, but he's less comfortable with English, is Gustavo Trujillo, the Cuban assassin.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that he drove as far as, this is the MMA fighter that we've talked about.
Oh,
Maybe having on here with a translator and all that.
Yeah, you should.
Who I, judging by his T-shirts, would not have his press people give us the requests for minimizing groseria.
I do my best. I do my best.
No, but he's
But you actually minimize groseria?
No, you can with Gustavo. I'm sure you'll have a contest of who does more groseria.
Listen,
Yeah.
I find myself
I
articulate.
really appreciate your content right now.
Oh no. But my point is, Gustavo, for example, an MMA fighter, who he lives in this guy went as far as Tampa and drove back, collecting stuff from Cuban American families on the way from Tampa to Miami,
in Tampa.
and now that shit's being sold. Sorry. But yes,
Vite.
vite.
No,
It's contagious.
It's tough when you get all worked up. I get
No.
worked up very easily, so it's
Yes.
not. It's part of just my fiber.
That part was beautiful. The part
Yes.
in which I have to confess, I was afraid. We started that. We asked for donations in the middle of a pandemic. There is also a crisis here in the state. It's not comparable. There's no point of comparison, but there is also a crisis. So we saw, okay, there is a possibility that people is not going to show up because they are taking care of themselves and their families right now. And hundreds of families passed by in the middle of the pandemic to leave their donations, to leave cans, to leave.
And then Cuba basically wanted no part of it. The
Exactly.
regime wanted no part of it.
Actually demonstrating who is the blockade between the aid and the Cuban citizens. Who is actually the obstacle.
Which is the government.
Which is the regime.
And it's
Which
and
is
it's
the
been that
regime.
way until about 2009. I was on the board of Raíces de Esperanza, and maybe around 2006 or 7, we did a similar drive during one of our. I don't know whether you were aware of them then. There were conferences on university campuses, and we did a similar thing, and it was the same thing. It got held up in Cuba. I don't remember at which port, but it was all like a collaboration between Raíces and Caritas Cubana.
Okay.
I think even though we put out pictures of our volunteers packaging the stuff and all that, we tried to make sure that our name was not attached to it because we feared that same sort of thing would happen. But of course, it happened. So this is a long-standing practice.
Yep. It is.
What where we're at right now, I know we're in a weird part of life, right? We're still in a pandemic, and the United States is in this like tumultuous like election thing, and it's a weird time. What are your personal goals for the next 5 years?
I hope we solve the situation sooner than that. I will explain myself. You could change your face.
No, because I was just gonna ask, what do you mean? That's all I was saying. What does this mean?
Tostones and carne de puerco, por favor. No, that also. But even when everything is so difficult and so dramatic in this point, we shouldn't lose sight that Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro are not in this world anymore. Raúl Castro is close to leave this world. The Cuban people are, which is the most important thing, and I should have begun with this, the Cuban people is not willing to bear that system anymore. I mean, for instance, the last month, they registered at least 42 spontaneous or organized protests against the regime, only during the last month. And those were the ones that were able to be documented in the middle of a country that has zero access to information, zero freedom of press, where at least 42 protests were documented.
That's
the
amazing.
Cuban people want change. The Cuban people is convinced that the way out of this crisis that didn't start with COVID-19, that started with the regime, is changing the system. So that I think there are other factors. The regime is very vulnerable, not just because of the biological factors, but also because of the lack of the lack of proposal. They have nothing to offer to the Cuban people, but they are stubbornness to keep power. And everybody understands that there is not going to be nothing good is going to come from the regime. Nothing good for their life. There is no hope on the regime. So I sense that the Cuban people is ready for that change. I sense that the Cuban regime is now more vulnerable than probably never in the history, or at least there are very few precedents of situations similar to this. And I also think that even when there is a lot of apathy in the international community, there is a lot of cynicism, there is a lot of complicity, there is also awareness that didn't exist 2 or 5 years ago. I mean, everybody in Latin America understands that what is going on in Venezuela is very bad, and almost everybody also knows that it's taking place because of the Cuban regime is helping. And the consequences for the democracies in the region, including the United States, have been more evident during the last years. So I think that we are in a special window to act, to put the bigger possible amount of pressure over those criminals that all that they want is to remain in power, to remain being millionaires with the resources that belong to the Cuban people. And those guys, I mean, probably Fidel Castro and the bunch of generals of this generation that are dying now had other resources to stay in power. But their sons and their grandsons and granddaughters, by the way, they have no symbolic legacy. They don't want to end their life with being in the red list of Interpol. So there is a lot of leverage that the international community now has to pressure them, supporting what the Cuban people is actually demanding, which is the change of the system through submitting that criminals to the will of the people. I mean, American administration, Europeans, Latin American democracies, they don't have to invent the solution for the Cuban people. We already have it, and it's actually very understandable and simple. Just ask the people. And by doing so, you are starting a transition process. And transition process are already started, and there are some ABC that you have to do. You need temporary laws. You need a new constitution. You need a transitional justice program. All this is more or less standard. And we could apply it once we force those criminals to submit to the will of the people. In order to do that, we need to rise the internal pressure, but we cannot do that in a reckless way. We need to do that with the support of that part of the Cuban nation that lives out of Cuba, and also forcing the international community to do what they should be doing since 60 years right now, which is supporting that people in their will to change the system. Now, I think that we have a set of conditions that make that strategy doable, at least more likely than it was 8 years ago with Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro being the prima donnas of Latin America.
Yes.
No, I'm good. I'm ready.
So no. So I want to transition to lighter things. No,
That's a hard transition.
I know, but I think I have found the transition.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the
favorite color.
Yeah, for me the transition.
Second glass of vodka.
No, I'm much. Well, that's also good. For me, the transition question is this, and then we can get into the lighter things about what life has been like here. How long have you been in the U.S.? Since when?
First time was 2013.
Okay.
But I have been in and out for a while.
Okay.
So, safe to say 4 years.
So, my transition question is, on all the things that we've talked about to this point, especially what the solutions are in the present, right? Not necessarily the history, although maybe there's some of the history. How, if at all, has your time away from Cuba affected the way that you see Cuba? Because it's a different perspective, no? You were in a peculiar position because...
That's the lighter question?
No, that's the transition to the lighter question. Okay. And then we'll get into lighter things.
I'm interested in the lighter, but I'm interested in this transition question too.
The lighter question relates to all of the non-Cuba things since coming here. And, a lot of people might be curious about what things you've experienced since... I think that you were in a peculiar position while you were in Cuba because you were so engaged and grew up with the movement, no? Mm-hmm. But how has that perspective or that experience of not being in Cuba changed how you see Cuba? And then we'll get into other things like American barbecue and stuff.
I get very suspicious of myself. I get very suspicious of my opinions, very suspicious of how would I think and speak if I were in my house in El Cerro in Havana. I think that that's the most direct way to answer your question.
Okay.
But also, I have now an understanding of how the world perceives our situation and how to communicate our situation, which is something that is a work in progress. It's never stopping, right? And I I think I have now a better understanding of the Cuban people and of our tragedy than I had when I only knew one perspective. I have a huge amount of compassion for people like your grandpas. I mean, I have been in a grocery here in Miami and run into a couple of old people, a marriage that have been together for 50 years. And the man have looked at my eyes, recognized me, start to talk to me, and told, and he suddenly told me, "We lost the best country in the world." Like that. I mean, that generation have the experience and the grief of having lost the best country in the world. No one in my generation is able to say that.
Yeah.
I cannot say that I miss the best country in the world. Of course, I miss my country every day. But I'm very aware that it's not the best country in the world. Your grandpas, my grandpas, our elderly, believe that they were living the best country in the world. And of course, that's an idealization. Of course, it was not a paradise.
Right.
But for some reason, that generation is able to say that, and my generation is not.
Yeah.
So I think now I understand better the Cuban nation.
Yeah. I think it makes me think of until earlier this year, I was working at a cigar magazine. And one of my colleagues was actually the cousin of Carluba, my business partner
Life partner.
my business life partner. And this is sort of a vulgar way of putting it, in the strict sense of the word vulgar. But he left Cuba maybe the same year that you did, maybe 1 or 2 years before. And we would travel a lot, writing travel stories. And of course, he would encounter Americans who would tell him, I can't wait to go to Cuba and eat all the Cuban food. And the thing that he would always tell people was that his favorite Cuban food was croqueta preparada. And that he had his first croqueta preparada when he was 26 years old in Miami.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
And so you gain an appreciation in some ways for
That's
all
a
of these
tragedy.
things, and you understand where you were from and where you live. There are things that you, of course, understand in a way that the two of us could never understand it. Yeah. And yet you had to leave to understand certain things about where you came from.
Yes, but for instance, I arrived in New York, I believe, March, February 2013.
Cold.
And I found there traditions and la sobrecama de la abuela better preserved that I have ever seen in El Cerro. So I don't know if that is a special condition of the Cuban community, but the way in which the Cuban people in the exile, that part of the nation in the exile, have been able and have cared enough to preserve those traditions, to transmit those traditions. Something that actually struck me like a lot was when Fidel Castro died. I felt it as a failure. My first reaction was unbelievable that this guy has died in his bed after all the crimes that he has performed. And then I turned on I was in Miami. I was in the house of my family in Miami. I turned on the TV, and I saw all those crazy Cubans going out, celebrating, and I said, this these guys are crazy. I saw, really? Why is that? What is there to celebrate? This criminal has died in his bed. But the day after that, I start to visit from the car. I didn't participate there yet. I start to see the faces of the people, the multiple generations, the deep incomprehension. I don't know how to say that in English. How the rest of the world were not able to
comprehend,
understand, to comprehend what was taking place.
Uh-huh.
And I was deeply, deeply moved to see grandmas that were not celebrating. They were just saying, well, at least he's not there anymore. And what was even more moving for me was to see the granddaughters and the grandsons, which do not speak quite well Spanish or Cuban, but were so happy because of their grandmas and their grandpas were at least living that moment, and they were celebrating in Versailles without actually speaking Spanish, but saying that they were Cuban and that they were happy. For me, I think that was a moment of epiphany. I mean, I think that it was a moment of actually understanding the tragedy and also all the dreams and all the potential that the Cuban nation has.
Yeah. So here's what I was transitioning to with that. So that's how not being in Cuba has changed your perspective on Cuba.
Let's get lighter.
How has your perspective on the United States changed, and what are some of the things that you've enjoyed the most in the short time that you've been here? And it doesn't have to be in Miami. To give you an example, again with Andy, I had it was a very unique position for me to be in. I was with somebody, traveling almost every month to do these travel stories for a magazine, and we were basically getting paid to be tourists. And he traveled more in a matter of 6 or 7 years than most people who were born here travel in a lifetime. Mm-hmm. And I imagine you've been in a somewhat similar position because this activism takes you places. So what are some of the things that that you're struck by? And you can go as deep and profound as you want about life here, or you had a sandwich that you really like, so whatever.
Yeah, the Belgian chocolate have been quite a
Belgian chocolate. You heard it here first.
Yeah, that was another epiphany. But the access to information. Mm-hmm. I mean, in Cuba, you're always struggling just to know what is going on.
Sure.
And here you have that window open. That's definitely something that I love about being free.
Yeah.
And the sense of power, in the sense in which the limit is set by yourself and not by the power. That's something that I imagine that only experience people that come from totalitarian regimes. And that's something that for an American kid or the most kids in the world, well, the half of the kids in the world, is taken for granted. Mm-hmm. I mean, you are going to get so far as you want. That's something that you cannot say in Cuba. And that's something that you can say here. There's some frustrating things also, but those are
sure
quite good.
Let's talk more about Belgian chocolate.
I'm a big fan of milk chocolate myself. I'm not a big bitter chocolate person, but
those two, but Belgium. It's new for me.
I can imagine. It's so it's been a total of like 4 years here, you said?
No, I have been in and out since 2013. But during the first years, I was going back and forth Havana and other cities in Cuba and traveling a lot. I mean, this pandemic has been actually the period of time that I have been like I don't know how to say it in Spanish, in English, but
say it in
that
Spanish.
I have been consecutivamente in the country.
Consecutively.
Yeah, consecutively here.
In the country.
Yeah. So consecutively in Miami or just in the country?
In Miami, and in the country.
What is because there's such a wide range of Cubans in Miami. You have my grandparents that have been here for a long time, and then you have people like Nick and I that are, Cuban, but born here. What are some of the things that you notice about the people and the culture that maybe have struck you a little differently?
There are some families that decided not to talk about Cuba. And in some cases, it led to a distortionate idea of what Cuba is for their grandsons and granddaughters. Because the thing with Cuba is that if you don't talk about it, others are going to do it. And if you do not transmit what you know, others are going to transmit what they are told to do. So it's sometimes frustrating to find Cubans that have a very twisted idea of their reality, or that have been in a very frustrating way intoxicated with the communist propaganda, even when they are in a free country and they are grandsons and granddaughters of people that suffer in the island. I could get very mad hearing excuses like, well, Cubans or all Cubans things like that because they cannot forget what they live in Cuba. I mean, there is nothing forgettable about it.
Right.
It's all the contrary. You need to explain the situation. You need to tell the history. Of course, people can take their own conclusions and they are invited to do so. But they need to have the information. They need to have the facts in a real and in a very concrete and accurate way. And that's definitely not the way that the Cuban regime and its gongos here in the States are selling. And there are a lot of them. I mean, there is even a July 26 movement in the States. Please check it. Check the website of July 26th movement in the States. They're a gongo of the Cuban regime. They are intoxicating the American public with lies and with very specific call to actions that goes from the end of the embargo to the silence of the dissidents. For me, it was so frustrating to discover, for instance, that, and we are very close to the elections, but I'm not talking about domestic politics, I'm talking about the international communism. It was so frustrating to discover that there was a website called International Progressive, in which you can find, for instance, people as Bernie Sanders and people as the Vice President of Spain and people as the elected president of Bolivia, and people as Noam Chomsky, and people as Gabriel Garcia Bernal, everybody together in this international or progressive international. And when you go and see what are the campaigns of this new forum, the first one is one that have been the slogan of the repressors against us in the international community, and by us I mean the Cuban dissidents. I have been repressed and screamed at and repudiated in international forums by the intelligence apparatus of the Cuban regime with the same slogan that the Progressive International has in their website, naming a campaign which name is Hands of Cuba. In Spanish, they say, Con Cuba no te metas. It means with the communist regime, hands off the communist regime. That's a campaign against the Cuban people. And it's the campaign that these guys that has all the right to get together and to disseminate their ideas have regarding to Cuba. That's very frustrating. That's a very distorted and twisted idea of what the international community should be doing. That's the opposite of being solidarious with the Cuban people. But we were being lighter.
Do you have anywhere that you want to go? We haven't talked food very much.
Oh, no. I mean, we talked about croqueta sandwich. That's pretty much the furthest that we went.
Which, by the way, I would like to invite you to eat here at some point when we're not doing all of this microphone shit.
Yeah. I think eating here would be a nice...
It would be my pleasure.
It would be an interesting perspective for our kind of our mission with our food and our company. But no, I mean, I think food-wise, we covered chocolate.
We did.
And
Belgium, but...
Belgium chocolate.
Specific Belgium chocolate.
But Baracoa chocolate is also great.
Which one is it?
Baracoa, which is from Guantanamo, but first we have to liberate Guantanamo. That part that is not the American base.
Watch out, Belgium.
Yeah. We're coming for you. No, I mean, I have food-wise, I have
You want to transition to our recommendations?
Please.
Yeah. I mean,
so this is how we always end the show.
Okay.
Everyone recommends. So it could be anything. It could be a book, a movie, a song, a place you went, a or a chocolate that you ate, whatever.
or a sandwich.
Or a sandwich. A croqueta
Yeah.
preparada. Anything you want to recommend to people who are listening. You can recommend as many things as you want. So you can go light, you can go whatever. I will start so that you have some time to think. I have two recommendations. Actually,
How do you have... we just did this yesterday. How do you have
Oh,
new
I always
recommendations?
have. I always have things. One of them is a shameless plug for a past guest. So you want to go to mybigfatcubanfamily.com.
Okay.
Or-
All right.
Or go to the Instagram page for My Big Fat Cuban Family that is run by one-time guest of this podcast, Marta Darby.
She's the best.
She is great. She is the original Cuban-American food blogger. She's, of another generation and yet was blogging before any of us even knew what blogs were.
I know. I think, didn't she just call me out on Twitter a little while ago?
Probably.
We did that croqueta, that video that you had. You
Maybe,
made
I
me
don't know.
do. Yeah.
I don't know. She
I
probably
think
did.
she did.
I'm sure you deserved it.
I did not deserve it.
But she's doing giveaways. So
yeah.
get on My Big Fat Cuban Family. You can find links to giveaways. She's because
What's she giving away?
I forget, but it's a bunch of giveaways because it's like the anniversary of her blog or something.
Wow.
So happy birthday to her blog, and go and enter giveaways for tacitas and things. I know tacitas is one of them, but you can win stuff. And then the other recommendation that I have, and this is the one that I was saying you might know this person. I highly recommend that if you are an Instagram person, you follow a gentleman by the name of Ruben Rabasa.
Oh, yeah.
Ruben_Rabasa is a national treasure in two countries.
He is a treasure.
He is a Cuban treasure and an American treasure. He was an actor in Amparo. again, connection to the podcast, although we never had Ruben on. And Ruben Rabasa is hilarious. No matter what language you speak, you should be following Ruben Rabasa. He did a complete nonsense instructional on making coffee. It makes no sense. Your coffee will be gross if you follow these instructions, but it was hilarious. So that's Ruben, like RUBEN _Rabasa, RABASA, Ruben Rabasa on Instagram. That's a person that you want in your life, even if only on your phone.
Talking about coffee.
We're going to be here another hour.
Talking about coffee. You know, Miami has a huge coffee culture.
Mm-hmm.
The Ventanita culture here is like a thing. It's a thing. It's just it's a way of life. You go there for a reason, and is that something that's the same way in Cuba or no?
Well, right now there is no coffee. I don't want to sound such a downer.
No, it's totally fine, because I think it's important for people to know that.
Yeah.
Yes, and yes, because it's like a dichotomy, because at the end of the day we're talking just about normal things that for a Cuban in Cuba listener could sound even frivolous.
Right.
But answer your question, my grandma, that is 92 years old, drink a cup of coffee just before going to sleep.
Oh, yeah. Me too.
And at 6 a.m. in the morning, my mother wakes up to go to work, make coffee, give her a cup of coffee, she drink it, and return to sleep till 10 a.m. She's 92. So yes, we are all intoxicated, like
with coffee.
I have a story here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that I think puts the downer in a light sort of way.
Perfect.
So my second time in Cuba, I was with two other guys, and we were doing all sorts of subversive things.
Mm-hmm.
Leave it open, I'll lock it.
And we had dinner at a paladar in Miramar.
No, I'm good.
And
¿Cuál?
Actually, you can take this.
ya se me olvida el nombre. It was an open air.
Give me those empty glasses. Real
Oh,
quick.
yeah, sure. Thank you, man. I remember that it was an open air thing. In any case, we were in this paladar, and it was, I mean, the waiter who was dealing with us, it was service on the level of like the best restaurants here. This guy knew what he was doing. And so he could tell from the way overhearing us talk, and probably, I have the look of a person who's not on a Cuban diet. And so he knew more or less where we were from. And so he says, would you like coffee? All this in Spanish, of course. And so we say, yeah, we'll have coffee. And he says, okay, well, we have Bustelo, La Llave, and Pilon. And we said, oh, how strange. They have a menu of different brands from the U.S. Like, you would think there would just be... So we huddle up and we, we decide, we settle on, I think, La Llave or whatever. And we said, La Llave. And he had been waiting. You could tell that he had been waiting the whole meal to do this to us. He goes, well, it was a different word in Spanish, but he says, you idiots, this is Cuba. You're going to drink the same crap that we that we drink.
¿Te dijo así?
Así mismo. No, we'll cut this part out. He goes, come, de Cuba, van a tomar la misma mierda que tomamos nosotros. I was like, extra tip for you.
I like that.
So anyway, I think that illustrates in some way what you're talking about, All right. You have recommendations?
I just think I find it fascinating, the things that we... Talking about the disparity between, I think, age groups of Cuban Americans and Cubans. Like, the way that my grandparents talk about Cuba and the way that I have connected to that thought process and the way that it's affected my life isn't like that for everybody. I think that's why Nick and I became quick friends, because we, we're talkers by nature, but we spoke about this at length, and we talked about the emotions and the feelings and the thoughts and the where do we go? Are we a forgotten tribe? There's so many things that we've talked about, but there's a large majority of the people that are in my age group that take so many things for granted. And for us, it's simple. You know, we go, and I do it every day. I'll find a point in the day. I'll go somewhere. I'll get a cortadito. I'll get a croqueta or a pastelito, and I'll do the whole thing. And I do that because I can. I love it, obviously. I love those things. But I do it because for me, it connects me to something that I feel like my grandparents taught me. That is part of our culture. It's part of who we are. And it's something that I will teach my kids one day. But there's such a large majority of people that take that for granted because they think it's just everywhere. It's just available at all times. So I think what you said was perfect. For the people that listen to this that maybe have a false sense of how things have changed, that they really haven't changed. And that we shouldn't, not only should we not take for granted the things that we're capable of doing, but the knowledge that we have at our fingertips by the people that allowed us the opportunity to be here, which is the older generation. So that's my recommendation for all you.
That's your recommendation? I'll take it.
Ungrateful. Yeah, I'll stop.
You have any other recommendations besides
I don't. We just did this yesterday.
I know.
I had bad
I know.
recommendations yesterday. Actually, I had a good recommendation yesterday, but I don't have another one.
How about this? Recommend a cookbook. Any cookbook.
Okay. Any cookbook.
Because we've been talking about this a bit, so I'm sure it's been on your mind.
Obviously, in the world of cookbooks, I always go to like a few, and I've had a hard time finding that creative part of my life as in the last like 2 months, only because creativity is not something that you could just turn on and off. It's something that just comes to you naturally, and it's either given to you or not. And the Joe Beef books that we've talked about at length, both of them. What is it? The Surviving the Apocalypse and The Art of Living, and the On Vegetables book by Jeremy Fox. Also, that one is always in my book bag. Always. On Vegetables is always in my book bag at all times.
Just in case you come across some vegetables and...
No, just because
You remember pastelitos. Huh?
Yeah, his thing is, 'cause he's from the West Coast. Their thing is avocado toast. So it's like, it's interesting. That book is, their geography and the kind of vegetables that they have is very different than what we have here. But the approach is what's, I find, something that is inspiring. So those are my cookbook recommendations.
Any recommendations? And then after this, we'll do shameless plugs where people can find you and your projects, but recommendations that are not related to you.
You should tell me that before.
I know.
See,
We always spring it on people.
Another failure by the production.
That 2 opportunities. Now I have to think.
That's okay. And we can cut if you have to think about it a little bit, but that's okay.
No, but I think that this one is both very interesting and also useful, which is the book of my father, which name is La Noche No Será Eterna. It's in Spanish for now, but soon it's going to be also in English. You can find it in Amazon. And if you want to actually get closer to the Cuban reality and to the Cuban history, the recent history, I really recommend it. It's a book that he ended a few weeks before being killed. He never saw it published. We did it after, obviously. But I found the information there and the approach very current and very useful. Not just for the Cuban people, not just for our Cuban nation, but for anyone that wants to have a clear, close taste of what the Cuban people have been living, and which is the perspective, the dreams of the Cuban society right now.
So La Noche No Será Eterna.
Correct.
And then we'll start with you. This is where we do shameless plugs.
Yeah.
Tell everyone where to find you and your things and your projects and your websites and all of that.
Well, you could go to cubadecide.com or .org, which is Cuba Decide, without the S, cubadecide.org or .com. And you can find us also in social media, of course, in everywhere we are Cuba Decide. And also you can find me by just Rosa María Payá in all the social medias and for website cubadecide.org. And also cubaincrisis.org, which is cubaincrisis.org, to have some insight about what is going on in the island and also how to support, for instance, initiative as Solidaridad entre Hermanos, which translates Solidarity Among Brothers.
Excellent. Shameless plugs, Mike?
All the same ones as usual.
Ariete Miami. Pig Inc.
Nave Miami. Pig Inc. Chug's Diner, which we will be giving people updates on our renovations as they happen, which they start November 3rd. Nave Miami, stay tuned for reopening details. Ariete Miami, stay tuned for all of our Thanksgiving deals. And when I mean deals, I don't mean like discounts. I mean like...
Give me all your money deals.
That's putting it the wrong way. But it's Ariete's Thanksgiving to go and Ariete's family-style menu for Thanksgiving Day. And all the other great things. We'll be releasing the November tasting for right after the 2 tastings next week.
Yeah. So I will end with our shameless plugs. You can find Pan Con Podcast on all of the social media things. It's Pan Con Podcast, like a podcast sandwich, on all of the social media things. The podcast sandwich, dademag.com/Pan Con Podcast. If you want to support the things that we're doing here, Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/dademag. And with that, I want to note, thank you so much to Rosa María Payá for joining us on this thing.
Can't thank you enough for joining our little podcast.
This has been, I think, illuminating in a way that very few of our other episodes have been. And also, because this might be the first time, maybe, that we've had someone on the podcast who... not only is English a second language, but you've been speaking English for less time than other guests. And I know that can be uncomfortable. I want to let you know, you speak better English than a lot of our guests.
Yeah.
Who don't speak any other language.
Yeah.
So, for
better
whatever
than Nick and
worth.
I, too.
Oh, I mean, yes.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, now you're generous. Okay.
I would name names, but I'm not going to name names of who speaks worse English.
I mean, all of our former guests.
Yeah, every single one. So thank you for that. And I want to also... pat myself on the back a little bit because you can only Mike knows how hard it was for me to go 2 hours and 10 minutes hearing a conversation about Cuba and not talking more than I did. It was very difficult. I want to congratulate myself for the restraint that I exercised on this podcast. I'm very proud of myself. And with that, thank you for joining us, Rosa Maria, and also all of you listening. That's it. Goodbye.
That's true. That's probably the truest statement that you've ever said.
Thank you.
Bueno, lo primero es saludar a la gente que está de Cuba en Estados Unidos, en Miami o donde quiera que estén. Y si son de Ciego, pues son de mi provincia, mucho mejor. Así que un abrazo bien fuerte y que sepan que aquí en Cuba les queremos y no creemos en las mentiras que nos cuentan de ustedes. Así que ánimo. Y los jóvenes de Cuba les mandan un saludo. Y la iglesia.